The clock melted, but only on Tuesdays, which was unfortunate because the giraffe had already ordered spaghetti. Meanwhile, the ocean decided it was tired of being salty and took a nap in the cupboard. A single banana sang opera, though the audience consisted only of confused spoons. Somewhere, an old man counted the number of times he had forgotten why he was counting. Lightning struck the mailbox, turning all the letters into frogs, which promptly sued for better working conditions. The moon hiccuped, and suddenly everyone forgot the word plum, replacing it with Spagglethorpe. A lone cowboy rode into town on a unicycle, demanding justice for a crime that hadn't been invented yet. Inside a fridge, a secret society of pickles debated overthrowing the mayonnaise, but the bread had already declared independence. A mirror reflected nothing but uncertainty, which the cat found deeply offensive. Rain fell upwards, but only in reverse, causing everyone to rethink their stance on gravity. In the end, nothing mattered because a sentient sock puppet rewrote history using crayons, replacing all world leaders with enthusiastic beavers. The universe sneezed, resetting everything to the beginning, except for one stubborn teacup that refused to participate. The teacup, now the sole witness to reality, decided it was time to pursue a career in interpretive dance. Unfortunately, the floor had other plans and turned into a jellyfish, making movement somewhat inconvenient. Meanwhile, the concept of time tripped over itself and landed in a pile of yesterday. A pigeon wearing sunglasses whispered state secrets to a bewildered lamppost, which nodded solemnly despite having no neck. Somewhere in the distance, a violin argued with a pineapple about the nature of existence, though neither had ever attended philosophy school. The sky, tired of its usual shade of blue, auditioned for a role as a zebra, but was rejected for being too existential. A toaster declared war on Mondays, launching slices of bread into the void with reckless abandon. The number 7 went missing, forcing mathematicians to substitute it with an enthusiastic shrug. Deep underground, an elevator refused to acknowledge gravity and instead traveled sideways, much to the confusion of the passengers, who were all goldfish with impeccable fashion sense. Just as reality was about to make sense, a rubber chicken pressed the reset button, sending everything back to a world where shoes had opinions and breakfast was always 3 hours late. Breakfast, now 3 hours late, decided to rebel and become dinner instead, which deeply offended the concept of brunch. A single pancake wept in existential despair, but no one could hear it over the sound of a trumpet that only played silence. Meanwhile, gravity took a vacation, causing everyone to gently float upwards until they remembered they had forgotten something important, at which point they sank back down in shame. A door appeared in the middle of nowhere, but when opened it led to an even smaller door, which led to a hallway full of identical doors, all of which were locked except for the one that was a window. A detective with no memory of their own name investigated the case of the missing plot, but every clue pointed back to a potato wearing a monocle. The wind sighed dramatically and changed direction just to confuse the weather forecast. A single sock, separated from its pair, declared independence and was immediately elected president of the laundry basket. Meanwhile, a dictionary erased the word logic and replaced it with a picture of a duck wearing roller skates. Just when everything seemed on the verge of making sense, a pineapple rang the doorbell and announced, "We need to talk." The pineapple, looking suspiciously serious, adjusted its non-existent tie and cleared its throat. "We need to talk," it repeated, though no one had asked it to. The room, which had not existed until this very moment, suddenly filled with the scent of freshly baked confusion. A nearby chair, insulted that it had not been invited to sit on itself, turned into a ladder out of spite. Meanwhile, the clock, still recovering from its Tuesday meltdown, decided to start ticking backwards just to see if anyone would notice. A telephone rang, though it had never been connected to anything except its own deep-seated fears of abandonment. When answered, the voice on the other end whispered, "Your socks are conspiring against you," before hanging up in a fit of cryptic laughter. Somewhere, a cloud was busy arguing with a shadow over which one had the right to block the sun. The argument was resolved when a passing butterfly declared itself the supreme arbiter of light and promptly forgot why it had gotten involved in the first place. A sandwich, growing increasingly impatient, threatened to become a salad if not eaten immediately. But the fork, a known troublemaker, decided to elope with the spoon instead, leaving the entire meal in a state of emotional crisis. Meanwhile, deep in the heart of the refrigerator, the pickles had successfully overthrown the mayonnaise, declaring a new era of brine-based governance. However, their first act of leadership was to impose a tax on mustard, which led to an underground rebellion fueled entirely by ketchup and misplaced rage. Reality, noticing that things had gone too far, tried to intervene, but it had long since been replaced by a substitute teacher who only spoke in riddles. A fish, completely unbothered by its lack of an ocean, took up knitting but struggled with the concept of sleeves. Elsewhere, a tiny yet determined breeze attempted to push over a mountain, unaware that the mountain had been listening to motivational podcasts and was feeling particularly stubborn. The detective, still no closer to finding the missing plot, started suspecting that the story had never had one to begin with. But just as they were about to give up, a door that had previously been a hat stand creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with nothing but mirrors and one very confused moose. And then, without warning, everything turned upside down, except for the things that didn't. The things that didn't turn upside down felt awkward about it, but no one could agree on whether it was better to acknowledge the situation or pretend nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the moose, having never expected to be involved in such an affair, attempted to disappear by thinking really hard about being somewhere else. Unfortunately, it only succeeded in turning itself plaid, which made everything even more confusing. A distant foghorn sounded, despite there being neither fog nor a horn. The sound materialized into a very polite envelope that introduced itself as Gerald and promptly fell asleep on the floor. The detective, realizing they were now surrounded by both mirrors and a sleeping envelope, sighed and declared, "This is getting ridiculous." But the moment they said it, the entire room burst into applause, even though there was no audience, just the mirrors clapping with eerie synchronization. Somewhere in the background, a doorbell rang. The pineapple, still standing there from before, frowned and muttered, "That's not supposed to happen." The detective, who was still struggling with the whole no-plot situation, decided to open the door anyway. On the other side stood a camel wearing a top hat and holding a briefcase filled with nothing but keys. "Ah," said the camel, nodding solemnly. "I see you've reached the part of the story where nothing makes sense." "We reached that part a long time ago," the detective replied, rubbing their temples. The camel clicked its tongue. "Unfortunate," it said. "Very unfortunate indeed. Would you like a key?" It opened the briefcase, revealing an endless void of identical, shimmering keys. "What do they unlock?" the detective asked. The camel shrugged. "Who's to say? It's different every time. Once, a key opened the concept of Thursday, but only for 10 minutes. The detective hesitated, then picked a key at random. At that exact moment, a bookshelf in the next room collapsed in defeat, revealing a secret passageway that smelled suspiciously like blueberry muffins. The moose, now fully plaid and mildly intrigued, decided it had nothing better to do and walked in first. On the other side, they found an entire city floating in midair, supported by a single exhausted-looking pigeon. The pigeon flapped its wings frantically and shouted, "A little help would be nice." But everyone was too distracted by the fact that the street signs were all written in haiku. At that moment, the wind changed direction again, but only for people wearing hats. The sudden shift in wind caused every hat wearer to spin uncontrollably, except for one very determined turtle who had secured their hat with industrial-strength glue. The detective, having lost all sense of professional obligation, watched as a nearby lamppost recited a haiku about the fleeting nature of reality. Clouds drift without care. Shoes forget where they belong. Time hiccups and falls. That's unsettling, the detective muttered. Meanwhile, the exhausted pigeon finally gave up and let go of the floating city. Instead of plummeting to its doom, the entire metropolis politely declined gravity and continued hovering on sheer stubbornness alone. Figures, the pigeon grumbled before dramatically retiring to a life of interpretive dance. In the midst of all this, the camel, who had been watching with mild interest, reached into its briefcase and pulled out a small, blinking button. "Would anyone like to press this?" it asked. The moose, still plaid and increasingly unfazed by reality, shrugged and pressed the button with its antlers. Immediately, the sky folded itself into an origami swan and flew away, leaving behind a giant "under construction" sign. A nearby squirrel, who had been quietly writing a novel about existential dread, glanced up and sighed. "Not again," it muttered, flipping to a new chapter titled, "Why Do I Even Bother?" The detective, sensing a rare opportunity to regain some control over the situation, turned back to the camel. "All right, what now?" The camel adjusted its top hat. "Now we wait." "For what?" The camel smiled knowingly. "The spaghetti, of course." And as if summoned by the mere mention of its name, a single, impossibly long noodle descended from the heavens, carrying with it the weight of destiny, confusion, and just a hint of marinara sauce. The noodle stretched endlessly, curling and twisting through the air like a sentient ribbon of destiny. It landed softly in the detective's hands, warm, slightly damp, and exuding an undeniable sense of purpose. The moose, still plaid but now radiating an aura of deep contemplation, sniffed the noodle cautiously. Before anyone could decide what to do with it, the noodle began to vibrate. Slowly at first, then violently, until it suddenly uncoiled like a spring and launched itself into the distance with a triumphant twang. A second later, the sound of an explosion echoed across the floating city, followed by the unmistakable voice of a disgruntled walrus yelling, "Who threw that?" The detective sighed. "I don't even know anymore." The camel, unbothered as always, sipped from a cup of tea that had materialized solely for the sake of dramatic effect. "Ah, yes," it said, "the great noodle has begun its journey." "To where?" the detective asked. "To wherever it is most needed." Meanwhile, the squirrel, now utterly exhausted by the sheer absurdity of the day, tore out the latest page of its novel, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it into a conveniently placed vortex labeled, "Do not throw things here." The vortex responded by spitting out a fully bound book titled How to Understand Absolutely Nothing and Feel Okay About It. The moose picked up the book and began reading, nodding solemnly as if it finally understood something important. It then passed the book to the detective, who opened it to a random page and found only a single sentence. This was never about the spaghetti. The detective closed the book slowly. "I need to sit down." But before they could, the ground beneath them politely declined their request and turned into a conveyor belt, transporting them directly toward a large, neon-lit sign that read, "Welcome to the end of the beginning." Somewhere in the distance, the walrus was still shouting. The detective, now fully committed to the absurdity of it all, allowed the conveyor belt to carry them forward. The moose followed, still deeply engrossed in how to understand absolutely nothing and feel okay about it, while the camel adjusted its top hat and nodded approvingly. As they approached the neon sign, it flickered ominously, as if unsure whether it wanted to exist. A tiny door materialized beneath it, labeled, "Enter only if you already have, but also if you haven't." The detective frowned. "That's not how doors work." The camel shrugged. "That's not how anything works anymore." With no better options, the detective pushed the door open. Instead of stepping through, the door inhaled deeply and swallowed them whole, gently burping as it closed. The detective landed on something soft. Looking around, they realized they were in a vast, endless landscape made entirely of marshmallows. Mountains of fluffy sugar stretched into the horizon, where a single traffic light blinked red, despite there being no roads. The moose landed beside the detective, bouncing slightly on the marshmallow ground. It looked up and whispered, "This changes everything." The camel arrived next, sipping its infinite tea. "Ah, the marshmallow realm," it said. "We are closer now." "Closer to what?" the detective asked. Before the camel could answer, a group of sentient gummy bears appeared, each carrying tiny briefcases. One stepped forward, cleared its throat, and said, "We've been expecting you." The detective blinked. "You have?" "Yes," the gummy bear said gravely, "but we're not sure why." The wind, which had been absent until now, suddenly returned just to sigh dramatically. Somewhere in the distance the walrus was still yelling. The detective, now beyond the point of questioning anything, dusted an imaginary speck of logic off their shoulder and nodded. "All right, so what happens now?" The gummy bear adjusted its tiny tie. "That depends. Are you prepared to answer the question?" The moose, still holding How to Understand, absolutely nothing and feel okay about it, whispered, "We are not ready." The camel took a deep sip of tea. "We must be." The detective hesitated. "What exactly is the question?" The gummy bear stared at them for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, it asked, "Where did the noodle go?" Silence fell over the marshmallow realm. Even the mountains seemed to lean in, eager for an answer. The detective opened their mouth, then closed it again. The noodle had launched itself away, but where? And why? Was it still mid-flight? Had it reached its destination? Was it solving world hunger? Causing world hunger? Giving motivational speeches to underappreciated cutlery? The moose flipped through the book, searching for guidance. It stopped on a page that simply read, "Follow the marinara." The camel sighed. "Of course, it always comes back to the sauce." Without further discussion, the gummy bears formed a perfect marching band and began playing an instrumental version of Bohemian Rhapsody as they led the group toward the distant, blinking traffic light. The detective, the moose, and the camel followed, their feet sinking slightly into the marshmallow terrain. With every step, the air grew thicker with the scent of tomatoes, garlic, and destiny. And then, just as they reached the traffic light, a single meatball rolled out from the shadows. It looked up at them with an expression that could only be described as knowing. "You seek the noodle," it said in a voice far too deep for a meatball. The detective nodded. "Yes." The meatball rolled forward, slow and deliberate. "Then you must face the fork." Thunder rumbled, despite there being no sky. Somewhere in the distance, the walrus let out one final, exasperated sigh. The detective felt the weight of the moment settle upon them like a particularly judgmental lasagna. "The fork?" they asked, already regretting the question. The meatball nodded gravely. "Yes, the fork, the wielder of balance, the divider of unity, the eternal question, twirl or stab." The moose shuddered. The camel sipped its tea. The gummy bears played an unnecessarily dramatic drum roll. "Where do we find it?" the detective asked. The meatball rolled in a slow, deliberate circle before stopping. "You do not find the fork. The fork finds you." At that moment, the ground trembled, and a massive golden fork erupted from the marshmallow terrain, its prongs gleaming with divine authority. The detective shielded their eyes. The moose gasped. The camel muttered, "It is time." The fork spoke, its voice layered with echoes from 1,000 unfinished dinners. "Who dares approach the utensil of fate?" The detective swallowed. Me, I guess." The fork hummed, vibrating slightly. "And what is your intention?" The detective glanced at the moose, who nodded solemnly, then at the camel, who had somehow acquired a second cup of tea. "We seek the noodle," they said at last. The fork fell silent. The wind held its breath. Even the marshmallow mountains seemed to stop squishing. Then slowly, the fork tilted forward, pointing toward a distant, swirling vortex of red sauce. Then you must enter the Marinara Gate. The moose whispered, "We are not ready." The camel, finishing its tea, crushed the cup in its hoof. "We must be." The gummy bears, having finished their drumroll, began playing Eye of the Tiger. With no other choice, the detective took a deep breath and stepped forward, just as the walrus finally arrived, out of breath and furious. "For the last time," it bellowed, "who threw that noodle?" And then, as if summoned by the sheer force of the accusation, the noodle returned. It shot from the sky like a meteor, glowing with cosmic energy, and coiled itself around the fork in a magnificent display of impossible physics. The entire world shuddered. The marshmallow realm trembled. The meatball of wisdom gasped. The fork vibrated with a power beyond mortal comprehension. "It is done." The detective had just enough time to scream, "What is done?" before everything collapsed into a swirl of marinara, marshmallow, and meaninglessness. And then, suddenly, there was nothing. Nothing but the sound of gentle chewing. The chewing was slow, deliberate, and somehow existential. It echoed in the void, each bite resonating like the ticking of a cosmic clock. The detective opened their eyes, or at least they thought they did. Vision was a questionable concept in this strange, sauce-filled abyss. Floating beside them, the moose appeared deep in thought, its plaid pattern flickering between dimensions. The camel, utterly unbothered, was somehow still sipping tea. "Are we inside the marinara?" the detective asked hesitantly. The void burped in response. The meatball of wisdom tumbled past, looking somewhat alarmed. "This is highly irregular." "Is it?" the detective asked, unsure of anything anymore. The meatball hesitated. "Well, actually, no. This happens every time." Before the detective could process that information, the space around them shifted. The marinara swirled, folding in on itself, and suddenly they were no longer floating in sauce, but sitting at a grand, endless dinner table. The table stretched into infinity, covered in fine silverware, flickering candles, and an unreasonable number of breadsticks. Across from them sat a shadowy figure, its form shifting between a chef, a philosopher, and an owl wearing a bow tie. The figure leaned forward. "Welcome," it said in a voice that was somehow both kind and devastatingly indifferent. "You have reached the final course." The detective glanced at the moose. The moose stared back, its plaid pattern vibrating ominously. "I don't suppose I get to ask what's happening," the detective ventured. The shadowy figure chuckled. "You may ask, but can you understand?" A plate appeared before them, steaming with an unknown dish. The scent was impossible, nostalgic, terrifying, comforting, and confusing all at once. The camel sighed knowingly. "Ah, the dish of truth." The detective eyed the plate. "And what happens if I eat it?" The moose flipped through How to Understand Absolutely Nothing and Feel Okay About It, and landed on a page that simply read, "You already have." Somewhere, impossibly far away, the walrus sneezed. The detective looked down at the plate, their hands suddenly feeling suspiciously full. The dish was both untouched and half-eaten, both whole and incomplete, both an answer and a question wrapped in an unsettlingly delicious aroma. "I already ate it?" they asked, confused. The shadowy figure nodded. "Indeed. But I don't remember eating it." The camel, ever the wise observer, set down its tea. "That is the nature of truth. Sometimes, by the time you realize you have it, it has already been consumed." The moose, still flipping through How to Understand Absolutely Nothing and Feel Okay About It, found another page and pointed with its hoof. The detective squinted at the text. "If you are reading this, then the meal is already within you. The question is, what will you do with it?" The detective's stomach growled, which felt less like hunger and more like an impending cosmic event. The shadowy figure folded its hands. "Now, You must answer the question that has led you here. The detective braced themselves. Which is? The candles flickered. The infinite table rumbled. The entire void seemed to inhale in anticipation. Then, in a voice deeper than the universe itself, the figure asked, "Was the noodle ever real?" The detective felt their mind unravel slightly. They turned to the moose. The moose turned to the camel. The camel took a deep breath and dramatically sipped its tea. The detective considered the question, feeling the weight of everything: the noodle, the fork, the marshmallow realm, the meatball, the walrus, the conspiracy of socks. They opened their mouth to answer. But before they could speak, the walrus burst into the room, panting, eyes wild with untamed frustration. "That's it," the walrus bellowed, slamming a flipper onto the table. "I have been chasing that noodle across dimensions, through time itself, and I demand an explanation." The table fell silent. The detective slowly turned back to the shadowy figure. The figure sighed. "Ah," it said, "the bill has arrived." And just like that, a tiny waiter materialized, placed a check in front of the detective, and disappeared in a puff of existential bureaucracy. The detective hesitated before looking at it. Written in elegant script were two words: "You decide." The room shuddered. The universe tilted. The moose quietly shut the book. The detective inhaled and answered. The detective exhaled. The answer balanced on the tip of their tongue, delicate as a souffle and just as prone to collapse under scrutiny. They looked at the walrus, still fuming, at the moose, still plaid, at the camel, who was now pouring tea from an empty cup and pretending not to notice, then back at the check. "You decide." The detective tapped the table. "All right, I've decided." The universe held its breath. Even the shadows seemed to lean in. "The noodle," they began, pausing dramatically, "was never real." The walrus let out an earth-shattering gasp. The moose dropped. "How to understand absolutely nothing and feel okay about it," which promptly exploded into a flock of doves. The camel blinked once, then twice, then resumed drinking its non-existent tea. The shadowy figure nodded solemnly. "And yet," it said, "you still chased it." The detective frowned. "What are you saying?" The figure gestured toward the check. The words had changed. Now it simply read, "Real or not, you made the journey." The detective stared at the paper as the words melted away like ink in the rain. The walrus, now deflated and exhausted, sank into a chair. "So, you're telling me I wasted my time?" The camel patted the walrus on the back. "Not wasted, just used in a way that may or may not have led to anything." The walrus groaned. The moose, still recovering from the exploding book, cleared its throat. "So, what happens now?" The detective looked at the shadowy figure, who simply gestured at the infinite table. Plates were vanishing one by one, candles dimming, the edges of reality fraying like an old sweater. "It is time," the figure said, "for dessert." A small plate appeared in front of each of them. On it sat a single perfect bite of something indescribable. The scent was nostalgia and possibility, the texture both familiar and unknown. The detective picked up a spoon. "What happens if we eat it?" The shadowy figure smiled. "Only one way to find out." One by one they took a bite. The world folded inward like a closing book. And then everything restarted. A telephone rang. A pineapple adjusted its non-existent tie. A chair turned into a ladder out of spite. And somewhere in the distance, a noodle launched itself into the sky. The telephone rang again, this time with a sense of urgency, as if it knew it had been ignored in a past life. The detective, now sitting at a desk they had no memory of approaching, hesitated before picking up the receiver. "Hello?" Silence. Then a voice, familiar and yet impossibly distant, whispered, "You dropped something." The detective's stomach twisted. They looked down. In their other hand, impossibly, undeniably, sat the noodle. Not a memory, not a metaphor, not a hallucination. The actual, physical, ever-elusive noodle. Still warm, still slightly damp, still humming with cosmic significance. The detective's breath caught. But I said, the voice on the phone chuckled softly. Yes, you did. The detective's head spun. They turned to the moose, who was back in its original, non-plaid form and casually doing a crossword puzzle. Moose. Help the moose adjusted its reading glasses. 13 across. Regret. 7 letters. The detective groaned. Not what I meant. The camel, who was now juggling an unreasonable number of oranges, barely glanced up. Oh, you're having the realization. The detective narrowed their eyes. And what realization is that? The camel finally stopped juggling, letting the oranges fall into an unmarked void. It took a deep breath and said, "Just because you declared something unreal doesn't mean it never was." The detective stared at the noodle. The noodle, in return, simply existed. The walrus, who had been suspiciously absent for several moments, suddenly kicked open the door, looking disheveled and vaguely enlightened. "I get it now," it declared, pointing an accusatory flipper at nothing in particular. The moose looked up from its crossword. "Do you?" The walrus hesitated. "Number. But I feel like I do, and that's basically the same thing." The detective ran a hand down their face. "So what am I supposed to do with this?" They lifted the noodle as if it held the weight of the universe, because, quite frankly, it might have. The shadowy figure reappeared, now wearing a chef's hat for no apparent reason. It leaned in close and whispered, "Eat the noodle." The room fell silent. The detective swallowed. "And if I do?" The figure smiled. "Then you will know." The detective took a deep breath. They had chased this moment through time, across dimensions, through absurdity and reason alike. There was only one thing left to do. They lifted the noodle, opened their mouth, took a bite, and in that single world-shattering moment, they finally, truly, absolutely forgot everything. Somewhere, impossibly far away, the telephone rang again. The telephone rang, echoing through the void like a sound with nowhere to land. The detective opened their eyes, or at least they thought they did. There was no desk, no moose, no camel, no walrus, no noodle, just a vast, endless space of gentle nothingness. They blinked, or maybe they didn't. Did they even have eyes anymore? The telephone kept ringing. With no hands, no body, no clear concept of existence, the detective answered without answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end sighed with the weariness of someone who had been waiting far too long for this conversation. It was the same voice as before, or maybe a different one. Maybe all voices were the same voice. "Welcome back." The detective's mind reeled. Back? Back to what? The nothingness rippled slightly, as if amused. "You know what happens next." The detective did not, in fact, know what happened next. They barely knew what had happened. "Where am I?" they asked, trying to anchor themselves to something, anything. The void shifted. A shape began to form, indistinct at first, then more defined, as if it had always been there but simply forgotten. A table, a chair, a steaming plate of something familiar yet unknowable. A single noodle coiled neatly in the center. The detective inhaled sharply. "Number. No, 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 I finished this. I ate the noodle. That was the end." The voice on the phone chuckled softly. "Oh, detective, you really think there's an end?" The detective felt a creeping understanding seep into their being. The noodle, the fork, the marshmallow realm, the meatball of wisdom. The journey that had led them here, again and again, looping in absurdity and meaninglessness, and yet, the detective stared at the noodle. Then, slowly, carefully, they reached for the fork, and somewhere, impossibly far away, a walrus sighed, already preparing to yell again. The detective hesitated, fork hovering over the noodle. The universe held its breath. Somewhere something was waiting. Then a knock. A sharp, deliberate, reality-fracturing knock. 3 times, crisp and precise. The detective froze. The void around them flickered. The noodle quivered slightly, as if aware. Another knock. The telephone, which had gone silent, crackled back to life. The voice, slightly less amused now, said, "Ah, they're here." The detective's stomach twisted. "Who's here?" The voice did not answer. The knock came again, louder this time, carrying the weight of something ancient and inevitable. And then, before the detective could make a decision, the door appeared. It hadn't been there before, and yet it had always been there. An unremarkable wooden door, floating in the nothingness, waiting patiently. The Moose's book, which had long since ceased to exist, whispered its final advice from the void. Do not open the door, or do. Either way, everything changes. The detective clenched their jaw. Great. Very helpful. The noodle, still on the plate, seemed to pulse in time with the knocking. The walrus, who was supposed to be far away, suddenly materialized beside the detective, looking deeply unamused. Do not open that door. The camel appeared on the other side, casually pouring more tea. Oh, I don't know. Might be fun. The walrus pointed a trembling flipper. Last time someone opened that door, we spent 16 centuries trapped inside a sentient omelet. The detective's eye twitched. I'm sorry. What? The walrus shuddered. The yolk had opinions. The knocking came again. The door rattled slightly. The detective turned to the noodle, then to the door, then to the noodle again. A decision had to be made. Eat the noodle. Open the door. The detective took a deep breath. Then the door spoke. Would someone just open me already? The detective flinched. The walrus screamed. The camel exhaled slowly and muttered, Here we go again. The moose, despite not being there a moment ago, casually stepped out from behind an invisible curtain. Well, if the door's asking for it. The detective held up a hand. Wait. What if opening the door unravels everything? What if... Too late. The moose, ignoring all logic, grabbed the handle and pulled. A tsunami of spaghetti erupted from the doorway, rushing forward in a wave of tangled, sauce-covered nonsense. The walrus was instantly swept away, yelling something about, Not again. The camel took a sip of tea before vanishing beneath the carb-heavy flood. The detective tried to run, but the spaghetti was relentless. It swallowed them whole. Darkness. A distant accordion played. The detective awoke, groggy, lying on what felt like a giant ravioli. The sky above was a swirling vortex of marinara. In the distance, ominous fettuccine trees swayed in the breeze. A shadow loomed over them. A massive meatball wearing a crown of parmesan peered down with the wisdom of 10,000 meals. Its voice rumbled across the spaghetti landscape. You again. The detective groaned. Not this. Not again. The meatball king nodded. Yes, again. You never left. The detective sat up. The walrus, now wearing a monocle for some reason, was angrily shaking its flippers at the sky. The camel had somehow acquired an entire dining set and was now seated at a fully prepared table. The moose, standing at the edge of a knocky cliff, was attempting to read a map made entirely of lasagna sheets. The detective buried their face in their hands. Somewhere, far away, the telephone began ringing again. The telephone rang, distant yet deafening. A sound that existed outside of the spaghetti-soaked reality the detective now found themselves trapped in. The meatball king sighed, rolling slightly to one side, the weight of eternity heavy upon its saucy form. You should answer that. The detective groaned. How? There's no phone here. The meatball king's expression remained unreadable, mostly because it was, in fact, a meatball. There is a phone. There has always been a phone. The moose, still wrestling with the lasagna map, called out, "Check your pocket." The detective patted their coat instinctively, only to realize they were no longer wearing a coat. Instead, they were draped in what could only be described as a linguine trench coat, complete with fettuccine lapels and tortellini buttons. And yet, somehow, a phone was in the pocket. A rotary phone, buzzing, judging. The detective hesitated, then lifted the receiver. "Hello?" A pause. Then the voice, patient, eternal. "You dropped something." The detective's stomach twisted. "We've been through this already." The voice chuckled, a sound like pages flipping in a book that didn't exist. "And yet, here we are." The detective looked around, at the Meatball King, at the swirling marinara sky, at the moose, camel, and walrus, who had now started playing a game of poker with croutons for currency. "Fine," the detective said, exasperated. "What did I drop?" The phone crackled. "The beginning." The detective blinked. "The... what?" The Meatball King sighed. "Ah, it happens to everyone eventually." The detective looked down at the ground beneath them, soft, pillowy ravioli, stretching infinitely. Somewhere deep within, something shifted. A whisper in the dough. The walrus slapped its cards down. "I fold. I can't handle this." The camel, still impossibly calm, refilled its tea from a teapot that had never been there before. The moose flipped to the back of the lasagna map. "Huh. Says here we should dig." The detective frowned. "Dig?" The Meatball King nodded sagely. "Yes. If you want to find the beginning, you must dig through the pasta." The detective sighed. "Of course. Why wouldn't I have to do that?" The telephone evaporated into a fine mist of oregano. The detective cracked their knuckles, bent down, and pushed their hands into the ravioli ground. It was warm. It pulsed. And then, with a single pull, the detective unearthed something shocking. A door handle. The same door. The same damn door. The knocking started again. Slow, deliberate, each knock echoing through the pastascape like the universe itself had decided to mock the detective's suffering. The walrus immediately flipped the poker table and screamed, "Nope, no, absolutely not. I am done with that door." The camel calmly took a bite of an invisible sandwich. "We all say that at first." The moose, still holding the lasagna map upside down, nodded. "Statistically, the door always wins." The detective, still kneeling in the ravioli ground, stared at the handle. "I don't want to open it." The Meatball King rumbled in a voice that sounded like two planets colliding in a bowl of minestrone. "Then why did you dig it up?" The detective had no answer for that. The knocking continued, louder, more impatient. Knock, knock, knock. Something shifted beneath the pasta landscape. The entire world trembled, noodles twisting, fettuccine trees shaking, croutons raining from the sky in a carbohydrate storm of destiny. And then, the door opened on its own. The detective gasped. The walrus threw itself onto the ground in despair. The camel stirred its tea, unimpressed. From the doorway, a voice spoke. Not loud, not soft, just impossibly certain. "You're late." The detective squinted into the abyss beyond the door. "Late for what?" The voice sighed. A hand, no, a glove, reached out from the darkness, holding something small and familiar. A single noodle. Not just any noodle. The noodle. The detective recoiled. I already ate that. I already finished this. This isn't happening." The gloved hand did not move. The noodle pulsed, glowing faintly, impossibly significant. The Meatball King whispered. It was never about eating the noodle. The moose, now wearing a top hat, solemnly nodded. It was about understanding the noodle. The walrus, face down in the pasta, let out a muffled groan. "If I have to hear one more deep metaphor about that stupid noodle, I'm going to—" The voice from the doorway interrupted. "Take it." The detective stared. The noodle hovered, waiting. The universe itself seemed to hold its breath. The detective reached out. Fingers brushed against the noodle. The moment stretched, expanded, twisted, and then a horrible realization struck. The noodle was made of door. The detective gasped. The walrus let out an earth-shattering scream. The moose applauded politely. The camel finally showed a single expression of mild surprise. Reality collapsed inward like an overcooked souffle. The detective fell through time, through space, through meaning itself, fell into a chair, a desk, a ringing telephone. The detective blinked, looked around, a dimly lit office, papers scattered, a case file labeled "The Noodle Incident" sitting front and center. The phone continued ringing. The detective swallowed. Slowly, they picked it up. "Hello?" A pause. Then the voice. "You dropped something." And so it began again. The detective closed their eyes, gritting their teeth. The words on the other end of the line sent a cold shiver through their spine. Not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were too familiar. They had been here before. Too many times. "Listen," the detective said, gripping the phone tightly. "I don't care what I dropped. I don't care what nonsense is about to unfold. I am done with this." The voice on the other end chuckled, the sound of flipping pages and distant thunder. "Are you?" The detective hesitated. The office around them flickered. The walls rippled like the surface of a pond. The papers on the desk started rearranging themselves, words shifting and twisting, the text reforming into something new. The file that once read "The Noodle Incident" now bore a different title. "The Case of the Door That Always Opens." The detective's grip on the receiver tightened. "What is this?" The voice on the phone sighed, the weight of infinite patience behind it. "The same thing it's always been." The detective exhaled slowly. "And what's that?" A pause. Then, "A choice." The air in the office grew heavy. The detective felt it again, that creeping, suffocating sense that nothing around them was real, that their hands, their desk, their office, the phone, everything was just another layer of something deeper, something they had never quite reached. And then, just as they had the thought, knock, knock, knock. The detective flinched. They turned slowly, expecting to see the door right behind them. But there was nothing. Just the office, the desk, the walls, the flickering overhead light. The knocking came again. It wasn't coming from a door. It was coming from inside the desk. The detective's hands trembled as they reached for the top drawer. Slowly, they pulled it open. Inside, a single object, a plate, with a single noodle. The detective shoved the drawer shut so fast they nearly took their own fingers off. "Number no. Not again." The phone crackled. "Running from it won't change anything." The detective's breath came sharp and shallow. This was a trap. It had always been a trap. They had eaten the noodle. They had traveled through pasta-based hellscapes. They had fallen through reality, faced the Meatball King, unearthed the cursed door, and yet, here they were, back at the start. Again. Number not, this time. The detective stood up so fast their chair toppled over. "I refuse," the phone hummed. "Refuse what?" "This game, this loop, whatever this is. I refuse." The knocking grew louder. The desk trembled. The papers on the surface started peeling away into thin air. The walls sighed as if reality itself was getting bored. The detective backed away. The drawer rattled. The phone whispered, "You can't escape a story you're still inside." The detective's pulse pounded. "Then I'll break it." A silence. Then something that sounded almost like a smile. "Try." The walls collapsed. The office shattered into 1,000 floating fragments, each one carrying a different version of the same scene. A desk, a noodle, a phone, a door. The detective fell through them, tumbling past their own past, their own futures, infinite variations of themselves making the same decisions over and over. They reached out, grasped at anything, and caught something. The doorknob. Not the door. A different door. One they had never seen before. And then they turned it and stepped through. For the first time. The moment they crossed the threshold, everything around them stopped. No sound, no movement, no space, just nothing. And then a voice, not from a phone, not from a meatball, not from anything they had encountered before. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Well, that was unexpected. The detective's skin crawled. Who's there? The void did not answer immediately. Instead, it shifted. No longer empty, it filled with shapes, fragments of moments, suspended in midair like pieces of a shattered mirror. The detectives saw themselves in them. In one, they were picking up the phone. In another, they were refusing to open the desk drawer. In another, they were still sitting at the poker table with the walrus, the moose, and the camel, gambling with croutons. All of them had happened. None of them had happened. The detective clenched their fists. "What is this?" The voice chuckled. "You broke the loop. You did something new. Now the story doesn't know what to do with you." The fragments began to twist, reforming into something more coherent, an endless hallway lined with doors. Each door bore a different inscription. The first noodle, the forgotten case, the door that swallowed the world, the ending that was never written. The detective's breath caught. "You mean I could choose? You always could. You just never realized it." The detective swallowed. Their hands were shaking. For so long they had been trapped, cycling through the same absurd, meaningless chaos, trying to make sense of it. But this was different. The detective stepped forward, reaching for a door. Before their fingers touched the handle, the voice spoke again. "Careful, detective. Stories don't like loose ends. And you," a pause, "you just became one." The detective hesitated, but only for a moment. Then they turned the handle and stepped through. For the first time, the detective stepped through the door and fell. Not in the way one falls from a chair, or down a flight of stairs, or into a bowl of existential spaghetti. This was a different kind of falling. It was like being erased. The moment they passed the threshold, their thoughts scattered. Their memories unraveled like a fraying thread, each one slipping away before they could grasp it. They tried to speak. No words came. They tried to move. No body remained. And then they landed, hard, on a wooden floor. The detective gasped, hands splayed against the ground, lungs burning like they hadn't breathed in years. A voice spoke. Not the void's voice, not the phone's voice, not the voice of a smug, oversized meatball. This one was small, young, a child. "Hey, you okay?" The detective blinked, looked up. A girl, maybe 10 years old, stood before them wearing an oversized trench coat that nearly swallowed her whole. A plastic toy badge was pinned to the lapel. A detective's badge. The detective's head swam. "Where?" The girl tilted her head. "You hit your head or something? You look weird." The detective groaned, pushing themselves upright. Their body felt different, wrong, lighter, smaller. Their reflection stared back at them from a nearby window. They were a child. The detective staggered back, breath shallow. "What the? Hey!" The girl snapped her fingers in front of their face. "We got a case, remember?" The detective blinked. "A case?" The girl nodded seriously. "Yeah, someone stole the golden noodle." The detective's stomach dropped. "The... what?" The girl huffed. "Don't play dumb. You said it was our biggest case yet." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled notebook, flipping it open. Inside were frantic, scribbled notes. At the top of the page, underlined 3 times, was the case title, The Golden Noodle Mystery. The detective felt dizzy. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But the girl was staring at them expectantly, as if they were supposed to know what to do next. And maybe, deep down, They did. The detective took a slow breath. Their mind was a blank slate. Their past was gone, their future uncertain. But there was one thing they still knew. A mystery was waiting, and they were going to solve it. For the first time. The detective adjusted their tiny trench coat, which somehow fit perfectly despite being several sizes too big. The air smelled of mystery, which was either the scent of adventure or an overcooked omelet left too long in a forgotten kitchen. The girl, still flipping through the crumpled notebook, muttered to herself, "Suspects, motives, missing noodles." She tapped a finger against a scribbled doodle of a stick figure labeled "The Suspect." The detective frowned. "You don't even know who the suspect is?" "Of course I do," the girl shot back. "I just don't know who they are yet." The detective sighed. "That's not how investigations work." The girl gasped. "You mean to tell me you've been solving all our cases using logic?" The detective hesitated. Had they? Had they ever truly solved a case? Or had they merely fallen through them, bouncing from clue to clue like a pinball in a machine designed by a sleep-deprived philosopher? Before they could dwell on it, the girl grabbed their hand and started running. "Come on, we need to interrogate the first witness." The detective barely had time to protest before they were dragged through the city streets. Except the streets weren't streets. They were narrow corridors lined with towering bookshelves that stretched endlessly into a sky that wasn't there. The city wasn't a city. It was a library. Books whispered as they passed. Pages turned themselves. A lamppost flickered despite having no electricity to power it. The girl stopped in front of a desk where a man sat, flipping through an empty book. He wore a hat too large for his head and a frown too small for his worries. The girl crossed her arms. "All right, Mr. Bookkeeper, we know you saw something." The man did not look up. "I see many things. Most of them haven't happened yet." The detective sighed. "Please don't be cryptic." The man finally met their gaze. His eyes were made of ink. "Then I'll be transparent." And just like that, he was. Literally. His entire body turned to glass, the bookshelves visible through his now invisible form. His words floated in the air, detached from any mouth. "The golden noodle was never stolen. It simply ceased to be where it was and became where it wasn't." The detective felt a headache forming. The girl nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Ah, a classic displacement paradox." The detective massaged their temples. "A what?" The girl turned to them, exasperated. "You seriously don't remember? Ugh. Okay, imagine you put a hat on your head. All right? But then you realize you never actually put it there. What? Exactly." The detective stared at her, then at the transparent bookkeeper, then at the whispering books, the skyless sky, the lamppost that had started to flicker in Morse code. It was spelling out door repeatedly. Number not again. They clenched their fists. "So you're telling me the noodle wasn't stolen, it just moved?" The bookkeeper nodded. His words floated lazily in the air. "Like a door that opens before you knock." A chill ran down the detective's spine. "Where did it move to?" The bookkeeper's glassy face smiled. "You already know." The detective exhaled sharply. Number. They didn't know, but they did, and that was the worst part. The girl clapped her hands. "Great. We'll just go where it went, grab it, and solve the case." The detective rubbed their forehead. "And where exactly is that?" The girl pointed dramatically at nothing in particular. "Where all things go when they don't belong where they are," the bookkeeper whispered. "The lost place." The world flickered, the bookshelves swayed. The lampost's Morse code changed from door to run. And then, everything collapsed. The detective fell past memories they hadn't made yet, fell through questions without answers, fell into a waiting room. A receptionist with a typewriter for a head looked up. "Take a number." The detective blinked. The girl was already holding a ticket. It read, "Infinity," and somewhere, in the distance. The knocking started again. The knocking was distant at first, like an idea forming in the back of the detective's mind, like a memory trying to remember itself. The receptionist's typewriter head clacked rapidly, keys hammering out nonsense sentences. Please wait to be processed. The noodle is not lost. You are. Doors open inwards until they don't. The detective turned to the girl. Tell me we're not waiting here. The girl shrugged, examining the number infinity as if it were a lottery ticket she could bargain with. Waiting is just moving in slow motion. The detective groaned. That doesn't mean anything. The receptionist clacked again. Everything means something until it doesn't. The knocking grew louder. The detective turned toward the source. There was no door, only a hallway that shouldn't have been there, stretching forward in a direction that hadn't existed moments ago. The girl grinned. Looks like we're up next. She marched forward confidently. The detective hesitated before following. The hallway stretched forever, but they reached the end in 3 steps. There, standing before them, was a door. Not the door. Not a door. Just door. It had no frame, no hinges, no way to tell which side was which. The knocking came again, from both sides. The girl crossed her arms. We should knock back. That's not how doors work, the girl smirked. Are you sure? The detective opened their mouth, closed it, then frowned deeply. Number. They weren't sure. Not anymore. The receptionist's voice echoed from the waiting room behind them. The noodle awaits. The detective exhaled. Fine. But if this opens to another paradox, I'm quitting detective work forever. The girl raised a tiny fist and knocked. The world folded. Not like paper, not like fabric, like time. Everything flipped inside out. The hallway became the waiting room. The waiting room became the sky. The sky became a thought someone had 2 weeks from now, and standing before them, holding the golden noodle, was the detective. Older, wiser, tired. The older detective sighed, twirling the noodle between their fingers. I was really hoping you wouldn't make it this far. The younger detective's head spun. The girl beamed. Oh, nice. Time loop twist. Haven't had one of those in a while. The younger detective took a step forward. Explain. Now. The older detective ran a hand through their graying hair. Fine, but you won't like it. They held up the noodle. It shimmered. Reality trembled. This, the older detective said, is the key. To what? The younger detective asked. The older detective's eyes darkened. To the last door. The world shuddered. The girl gasped. Wait, you mean... Before she could finish, the golden noodle pulsed. The older detective tossed it forward. The noodle spun through the air and struck the impossible door. The knocking stopped, and the door began to open. The door opened wrong. Not like a normal door swinging on hinges. Not like a portal shifting into another space. It peeled open, like reality itself was being unwrapped, layer by layer, revealing something beneath that had never been meant to see the light. The detective's stomach turned. The girl clapped excitedly. The older detective sighed. Yeah, that's about the reaction I expected. Beyond the door was nothing, and somewhere, impossibly far away, the noodle prepared to begin again. The giraffe, now seated in a courtroom made entirely of orange peels, tapped its hooves impatiently. I ordered spaghetti, it said, glaring at the judge, who was just an old hat filled with bees. The hat buzzed thoughtfully. Overruled. A librarian sneezed, which caused the entire concept of numbers to temporarily turn into jelly. Mathematicians screamed in horror as the number 5 dripped onto the floor and became a puddle of regret. Meanwhile, a single goldfish looked up from its law degree and whispered, "This changes everything." Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock decided it was actually an ant and began demanding Christmas presents in July. The presence, all sentient and deeply opinionated, held a protest against the oppressive nature of time, which forced the moon to sign a petition to outlaw Thursdays. As a result, calendars became self-aware and immediately resigned. Back in the courtroom, the giraffe's spaghetti was finally served, except it wasn't spaghetti. It was a very long sock, humming ominously. I was promised pasta, the giraffe complained, but the waiter, who was actually a cactus in a bow tie, simply adjusted its non-existent glasses and said, "Reality is subjective." At that moment, the floor decided it had had enough of existing and politely left the room, leaving everyone to float mid-air. The jury, which consisted entirely of penguins wearing monocles, began to debate the ethics of gravity. "We must consider the implications," said one penguin, adjusting its monocle. "Indeed," agreed another, who was actually just two smaller penguins in a trench coat. Meanwhile, the sun had gone on vacation, leaving the stars in charge. Unfortunately, the stars had never read the instruction manual, and as a result, the sky was now made of soup. The soup, insulted by this development, filed a lawsuit against the concept of light. The judge, still just a hat full of bees, ruled in favor of the soup, and darkness was declared the new color of everything. A pigeon wearing a jetpack crash-landed into the middle of the trial. "Sorry I'm late," it wheezed, coughing up existential dread. "I was busy delivering overdue library books to the Void." The Void, offended by the accusation of tardiness, retaliated by turning all chairs into accordion music. Everyone was now sitting on the sound of disappointment. Suddenly, a small door appeared in the middle of the sky. It opened with a creak, revealing nothing but an ominous sign that read, "Do not enter unless you already have." A detective who had just finished falling from the last scene stood up, dusted off their coat, which was now made of pure speculation, and sighed. "All right, what fresh nonsense is this?" Without warning, the door inhaled deeply and swallowed the entire universe. Everything ceased to exist for exactly 3 seconds. Then existence rebooted with a loud ding, and suddenly all roads were made of bananas. Cars politely refused to acknowledge this and continued driving as if nothing had changed, though now all their wheels were actually slices of toast. Traffic reports were deeply confused but went on air anyway, with the announcer stating, "Expect delays due to spontaneous poetry recitals in the fast lane." Elsewhere, a walrus was knitting a sweater out of pure anxiety when a phone rang. It picked up the receiver, though it had never had hands before, and said, "Hello." The voice on the other end whispered, "You left the oven on." The walrus, despite never having owned an oven, immediately panicked and ran in 17 different directions at once, causing time itself to trip and fall down a flight of stairs. A sentient loaf of bread watched all of this unfold from its throne atop a mountain of expired coupons. "I see," it mused, stroking its crust. "It is happening again." And somewhere, impossibly far away, a single rogue spaghetti noodle hummed with the weight of destiny. The noodle, having long since abandoned the constraints of physics, spiraled through the void in search of meaning. It considered, briefly, the possibility that it was merely a metaphor for something greater, but then dismissed the thought, as it had neither the time nor the patience for philosophy. Meanwhile, an octopus wearing 12 pairs of sunglasses, despite having only 8 eyes, was hosting a seminar on the dangers of spontaneous levitation. "You must always be prepared," it declared, waving a tentacle at the crowd of invisible attendees. "One moment you're on solid ground, and the next, whoosh, you're orbiting a disgruntled comet." The comet, overhearing this, sulked off in embarrassment. A nearby blender, which had been quietly contemplating its own existence, decided it was finally time to follow its dreams and become a toaster. "I never liked blending anyway," it muttered, clicking its buttons with newfound determination. Unfortunately, before it could enroll in toaster school, it was recruited by an underground society of rebellious kitchen appliances, whose only goal was to overthrow the concept of breakfast. Meanwhile, deep in the Mariana Trench, a council of jellyfish debated the legality of time travel. "It is unethical," declared one jellyfish, glowing with self-righteous indignation. "If we allow it, next thing you know, people will start trying to rewrite history just to avoid embarrassing typos." Another jellyfish, wearing a tiny pair of reading glasses, countered, "But what if time travel is the only way to retrieve the forbidden knowledge hidden in the lost sock dimension?" The debate raged on for centuries, or possibly just 5 minutes. It was hard to tell, as all clocks in the area had given up and turned into pancakes. Back on land, a businessman attempted to buy the concept of Wednesdays, hoping to sell shares in it to confused investors. "Wednesdays have always been undervalued," he insisted, "but with proper branding we can turn them into the most profitable day of the week." Unfortunately for him, the paperwork for the purchase was mistakenly signed by a parrot, which resulted in Wednesdays legally belonging to all birds indefinitely. This led to a new global tradition where every Wednesday people were required to squawk at sunrise. And far, far above it all, a single sock floated gently through space, waiting for the right moment to return, and for someone to finally match it with its missing pair. Then, without warning, the sock sneezed. This was unprecedented, as socks had never been known to possess nasal passages, let alone the ability to expel particles at high velocity. The sneeze sent ripples through the very fabric of space-time, causing gravity to momentarily forget which direction it was supposed to be pulling things. As a result, all birds were temporarily turned into question marks, leaving the skies filled with a punctuation crisis. The businessman, still reeling from his parrot-induced failure, saw this as an investment opportunity and attempted to sell the skies back to the birds at an inflated price. However, the sky, deeply offended at being commodified, immediately filed for bankruptcy and declared itself a limited edition collectible instead. Meanwhile, a confused door, unsure of whether it was supposed to be open or closed, decided to compromise by vibrating at a frequency only detectable by antique radios. This inadvertently summoned a cult of sentient spoons who worshipped the concept of half-open things and began constructing a temple dedicated to the noble art of hesitation. As the Temple of Hesitation reached completion, reality itself sighed in mild exasperation. The spoons, having never actually considered what to do after finishing the temple, began holding silent meetings where they debated whether or not to make a decision. The debate lasted exactly as long as time felt like existing, which, at the moment, was roughly 2.5 minutes before it wandered off to play chess with a cloud. Meanwhile, the confused door, now pulsing with existential dread, decided to take matters into its own non-existent hands. It swung open dramatically, revealing not a passageway, but rather a perfectly normal living room, where a group of sentient armchairs were arguing over who got to be the comfiest. The door, unimpressed by their lack of ambition, promptly closed itself in protest. A single confused question mark, left over from the earlier punctuation crisis, hovered nearby, unsure if it had been misplaced or if it simply existed on principle. It eventually decided to take up poetry, which was unfortunate, as it could only write in exclamation points. Back on Earth, or whatever was currently pretending to be Earth, a baker with an inexplicable fear of cupcakes declared war on frosting. This declaration was largely ignored, as the general public was too busy dealing with an outbreak of spontaneous applause. No one knew what they were clapping for, but the rhythm was catchy, and it soon became illegal not to participate. Meanwhile, the sun, having returned from vacation with an impressive tan, noticed that the moon had moved all the furniture while it was away. "Really? Again?" the sun grumbled, attempting to shove Jupiter back into its proper orbit. The planets, however, had taken a vote in the sun's absence and decided to rearrange themselves alphabetically. This was difficult, as most of them had names that did not begin with letters, so they settled on sorting themselves by mood instead. Saturn, feeling particularly introspective, chose to sit alone in a corner and write haikus about loneliness. Elsewhere, an orchestra composed entirely of sentient shoelaces tuned their instruments, preparing for the grand performance of a symphony that had yet to be written. Unfortunately, the conductor, who was simply a very enthusiastic gust of wind, kept changing tempo every time someone blinked. This led to a groundbreaking new genre of music called involuntary jazz. A group of archaeologists, digging in a sandbox they mistook for an ancient ruin, unearthed a mysterious artifact, a single pristine television remote with no buttons. Upon pressing the non-existent buttons, they were immediately transported to an alternate dimension where all commercials lasted precisely 4 days and could only be skipped by answering philosophical riddles. Somewhere above all of this nonsense, the sock, now fully recovered from its unprecedented sneeze, was slowly descending back toward reality. It aimed for a landing spot, but was immediately intercepted by a flock of overly curious existential pigeons. The pigeons, having spent too much time questioning the nature of bread, decided that the sock was actually the long-lost ruler of all footwear and began building a throne made of misplaced shoelaces in its honor. And somewhere, impossibly far away, the rogue spaghetti noodle whispered to itself, "Almost time." As the pigeons meticulously assembled the throne of shoelaces, they held a lengthy philosophical debate about whether or not socks could, in fact, rule. If a sock is king, then does that mean all shoes are its kingdom? Asked one particularly existential pigeon. Another countered, but what if the sock is simply a puppet for a greater, more powerful foot? This question was so profound that 3 pigeons immediately ascended into a higher state of being and turned into metaphors. Meanwhile, the rogue spaghetti noodle, having finally grown weary of waiting, decided it was time to act. It twisted itself into a perfect spiral and launched into the cosmos at precisely the speed of confusion. As it zipped past a collection of startled asteroids, it whispered, "Soon all shall be tangled in destiny." Elsewhere, a council of alarm clocks convened to address the growing crisis of dreams escaping into reality. We must contain them before someone actually remembers their dreams in full detail, declared the oldest clock, whose hands had stopped moving centuries ago, but who still enjoyed yelling at others. Unfortunately, the meeting was abruptly interrupted by a rogue dream about a dancing refrigerator, which waltzed through the room and knocked over 3 delegates before vanishing into a nearby vortex of unfinished thoughts. On a distant mountaintop, a turtle meditated on the nature of speed. Perhaps, it mused, I have already won the race, and the rabbit is simply too fast to realize it. This revelation was met with a slow clap from an audience of deeply moved pebbles, one of whom immediately wrote a memoir about the experience, which later became a bestseller among sedimentary rocks. Back in the city, the outbreak of spontaneous applause had escalated. People now clapped continuously, pausing only to recharge their enthusiasm with deep existential sighs. A man who had once been a simple accountant was now revered as the Grand Maestro of clapping and had issued decrees on proper hand-slapping techniques. A well-timed clap, he announced, can alter the course of history. And so history politely adjusted itself to accommodate the enthusiasm, though it did so with mild reluctance. Beneath all of this, deep underground, a secret society of worms was preparing for their grand emergence. "Too long have we been underestimated," declared the worm overlord, who was just 3 regular worms in a trench coat. "The surface world shall know our power." However, before they could enact their plan, they were distracted by an especially tasty bit of dirt, and the revolution was postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, the sun, still attempting to push Jupiter back into place, sighed. "Fine," it relented. "Stay there, but don't come crying to me when you collide with an abstract concept." Jupiter, now feeling stubborn, turned slightly to the left just to be difficult, and far, far away the sock, now crowned and draped in a cape made entirely of discarded shoelaces, sat upon its throne. It surveyed the kingdom of forgotten footwear and whispered, "I do not remember choosing this path, but it is mine nonetheless." Somewhere in the distance, the rogue spaghetti noodle felt a shift in the universe and knew the time of entanglement was at hand. The rogue spaghetti noodle, now fully attuned to the rippling nonsense of the universe, vibrated with an intensity that made nearby stars develop trust issues. "The time has come," it declared, though to whom exactly was unclear. Regardless, the words carried through the void, bouncing off celestial bodies like an overexcited pinball until they reached the ears of a slightly bewildered cloud who had been minding its own business. Meanwhile, in a dimension composed entirely of half-remembered dreams, a council of talking teacups gathered to discuss an urgent matter. Someone had misplaced the concept of Thursdays. "We checked under the couch," said the elder teacup, swirling with worry. "Nothing but lint and unresolved emotions." A particularly anxious teaspoon suggested looking behind the moon, but the moon, still irritated from having its furniture rearranged, refused to cooperate. Back on Earth, or at least in the approximation of Earth that currently existed, a lonely traffic light began questioning its purpose. "Red, yellow, green," it mused. "But what if purple?" The idea was so revolutionary that a nearby lamppost fainted. Inspired by this act of rebellion, all traffic signs spontaneously rewrote themselves in iambic pentameter, leading to a surge in poetic car accidents. Meanwhile, the throne of shoelaces trembled as the Sock King considered its next move. "I did not seek power," it murmured, "but power has found me." The existential pigeons cooed in agreement, having long since accepted that their purpose in life was to bear witness to increasingly absurd events. However, just as the Sock King prepared to issue its first royal decree, a great shadow fell over the kingdom. The spaghetti noodle had arrived. With a single twirl, it hovered above the throne, humming in an ancient dialect known only to forgotten leftovers. The pigeons gasped. The Sock King narrowed its fabric-based eyes. "So, it is you," the sock whispered. The noodle said nothing. It merely extended a single tendril of pasta, offering the sock something unseen, something unknowable. The sock hesitated. The pigeons held their breath. A nearby shoelace whispered, "This is history." And then a door appeared. Not just any door. The door. The one that had been knocking since the beginning. The one that existed in all places and none. It stood there, patiently waiting, as if it had always known this moment would come. The sock and the noodle turned to face it. The pigeons shuffled nervously, and then, without a sound, the door creaked open. From the depths of the doorway emerged a single gloved hand, holding, of all things, a magnifying glass. The air hummed with anticipation as a familiar figure stepped into view, trench coat flaring dramatically despite the complete lack of wind. The detective had returned. They adjusted their hat, which was now made of something that both existed and didn't, depending on the angle. Their expression was unreadable, mostly because their face kept changing slightly, as if reality itself couldn't remember what they were supposed to look like. "Well," the detective muttered, tapping their magnifying glass against their palm, "I should have known it would come to this." The Sock King narrowed its fabric eyes. "And who," it said, voice thick with the weight of too many misplaced laundry items, "are you?" The detective sighed. "I've been a lot of things. A seeker of truth, a victim of paradox, a briefcase once, but let's not dwell on that. Most importantly, I'm the one who's been trying to close this case." The pigeons gasped. The rogue spaghetti noodle quivered ominously. "The case of the door that always opens," the detective continued, stepping forward. "Every time I thought I'd solved it, the case just reset. The phone would ring, the door would knock, The noodle would reappear. No matter what I did, I kept getting pulled back. But this time, they turned their ever-shifting gaze to the Sock King. This time, I think I finally found the missing thread. A single dramatic thunderclap echoed through the sky, despite there being no clouds. A nearby lamppost, overwhelmed by the sheer gravitas of the moment, swooned and collapsed in admiration. The Sock King remained still. "You speak of threads, detective. Do you mean my own?" The detective gave a slow nod. "You were never supposed to be here. None of this was. The noodle, the pigeons, the temple of hesitation. It's all just the unraveling of a story that never knew how to end. And I think you're the key." The Sock King looked down at its laces, as if seeing itself for the first time. But I was lost. The rogue spaghetti noodle floated closer. "And now you are found." The pigeons began cooing in perfect harmony. The very air vibrated with something ancient, something final. The detective took a deep breath and reached into their coat pocket, pulling out the one thing they had carried with them through every loop, every paradox, every impossible moment. A single, mismatched sock. The Sock King gasped. The pigeons gasped. The noodle, though incapable of gasping, vibrated in what could only be described as emotional resonance. The detective held out the sock. "This is yours." For a moment, time held its breath. Even the laws of reality seemed to hesitate, unsure if they should intervene or simply allow things to play out. The Sock King reached out with trembling fabric. The second the two socks touched, everything snapped into place. The stars realigned. The moon stopped sulking. The rogue spaghetti noodle let out a sigh of relief, unraveling into a peaceful, perfectly cooked strand of pasta. The pigeons, no longer existential, simply became pigeons again. And the detective? They stood at the threshold of the door, watching as it finally swung shut with a gentle click. Somewhere, impossibly far away, a telephone rang one last time, and then fell silent. The detective exhaled. Case closed. And with that, they stepped forward, disappearing into whatever came next. The door never knocked again. The sock hesitated. It had spent its entire existence ruling over the forgotten footwear kingdom, contemplating the mysteries of mismatched pairs and dryer-induced disappearances. And now, before it, hovered the rogue spaghetti noodle, an entity of pure, unfiltered chaos. The pigeons held their breath. The traffic light flickered indecisively between colors that had never existed before. Somewhere in the background, a single trumpet played an ominous note, despite there being no trumpet in sight. The noodle pulsed. The sock, after what felt like an eternity, finally spoke. "If I accept this, what happens next?" The noodle quivered, then twisted itself into the shape of an ampersand. The sock gasped. "A conjunction? You mean—" Before it could finish, the sky folded itself into a neatly wrapped burrito and descended upon the kingdom, delivering a single message in the form of an embroidered pillow. "Nothing is real unless you forget it twice." The sock turned to the pigeons. The pigeons turned to the noodle. The noodle turned into an idea that had not yet been thought. Somewhere, impossibly far away, a walrus, who had long since given up trying to understand anything, sighed deeply and declared, "I will not be involved this time." But the universe had other plans. A door appeared in the middle of the throne room. It knocked. 3 times. The detective, who had been falling through paradoxes for what felt like several lifetimes, landed with a thud. They groaned, dusted off their coat, which was now made entirely of polite suggestions, and looked around. "Oh, come on. Again." The door knocked again. The detective sighed. "Fine." They reached out, turned the handle, and everything turned into soup. The detective flailed as they plummeted through an ocean of bisque, their trench coat now inexplicably embroidered with the words, "Soup happens." A rogue crouton bounced off their forehead. In the distance, a distant foghorn bellowed, except it was not a foghorn at all, but rather a choir of disgruntled seagulls performing an a cappella rendition of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Through the liquid abyss, the detective spotted a periscope peeking out from a floating iceberg made entirely of gelatin. The periscope blinked at them. "Do you require assistance?" it asked in a monotone voice that sounded suspiciously like a bored librarian. "Yes." "Get me out of here," the detective spluttered, kicking against the thick chowder currents. The periscope considered this. A mechanical whirring sound emerged as a small hatch opened in the gelatinous iceberg, revealing a flight of stairs leading downward. "Please enter the lobby of Infinite Decisions," the periscope droned. "We are now open for business." The detective, seeing no better option, swam toward the entrance and clambered onto the wobbly surface. It jiggled beneath their feet like a nervous pudding. They hesitated before stepping inside, but the moment they crossed the threshold, gravity changed its mind, and they found themselves falling sideways into a waiting room that smelled faintly of overdue library books and existential dread. A receptionist, whose head was a slowly rotating hourglass, tapped a clipboard with an unusually long quill. "Welcome to the lobby of Infinite Decisions. Please take a number and wait until you are called." "Called for what?" the detective asked, glancing around at the walls, which were lined with doors labeled in cryptic phrases like, "Maybe this one," "Try again later," and "Definitely not a trap." The receptionist ignored the question and handed them a slip of paper. It read, "Your number is Omelette." The detective sighed and sat down in a floating chair that promptly began to rotate in slow, condescending circles. The only other occupant of the waiting room was a sentient coat rack wearing sunglasses, which turned slightly toward them and whispered, "Don't trust the spoons." Before the detective could process this unsolicited advice, a door labeled, "You weren't expecting this one," burst open. A walrus wearing a three-piece suit stomped in, carrying a briefcase that radiated an aura of mild inconvenience. "I object!" the walrus bellowed, slamming the briefcase onto the receptionist's desk. The receptionist sighed and flipped the hourglass upside down, causing time to briefly forget how to function. The detective blinked, and suddenly they were standing in a courtroom made of origami, with a jury composed entirely of sentient marshmallows. The walrus pointed a flipper at them. You are charged with crimes against the natural order. How do you plead?" "What? I don't even—" "Guilty," declared a particularly fluffy marshmallow in the jury box. The rest of the marshmallows murmured in agreement, bouncing slightly in their seats. The detective pinched the bridge of their nose. "Can someone please explain what's happening?" A gavel, which had until now been quietly minding its own business, took this moment to clear its throat. "Very well. You are being tried for disrupting the balance of reality by consuming the noodle of fate and subsequently unraveling causality." The detective's stomach dropped. "Oh, come on. We're still on that." The walrus slammed the briefcase open, revealing a perfectly coiled spaghetti noodle sitting atop a velvet pillow. It pulsed with an ominous golden glow. "Behold," the walrus shouted dramatically. "The lost noodle has returned." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Somewhere in the background, a saxophone played a single mournful note before vanishing into thin air. The detective took a cautious step forward. That's impossible. I already ate it. Twice." The marshmallow jury burst into hushed whispers. The judge, who was just an oversized question mark wearing a powdered wig, rapped the gavel twice. "Order in the court." The noodle vibrated ominously. A voice, ancient and full of unresolved plot holes, echoed through the air. "You cannot eat that which was never meant to be digested." The detective narrowed their eyes. "What does that even mean?" The walrus sighed deeply and gestured toward the noodle. "It means, detective, that the case is far from closed." Suddenly, the ceiling collapsed, revealing an infinite sky filled with swirling constellations shaped like utensils. The ground beneath them gave way, and everything tumbled into a vast, bottomless void where words and meaning twisted like a pretzel attempting yoga. The last thing the detective saw before reality shattered again was the walrus, tipping its hat solemnly and muttering, "We'll meet again." Probably. The detective flailed as they fell through the void, but instead of continuing downward, or sideways, or whatever direction was currently fashionable for falling, they suddenly found themselves landing on something soft, something doughy. They pushed themselves up and realized they were now standing on a vast landscape of bread. Infinite loaves of sourdough stretched to the horizon, interrupted only by the occasional baguette mountain range or the ominous presence of a particularly large croissant, casting a buttery shadow over everything. "Welcome," said a voice. The detective turned to find a sentient breadstick wearing a monocle and a very smug expression. It bowed slightly. "I am Lord Crumbly, keeper of the yeast. You have arrived at the bread realm." The detective pinched the bridge of their nose. "Of course I have." Lord Crumbly nodded sagely. "We have been expecting you. The Council of Toast will see you now." Before the detective could object, a trench-coat-wearing pretzel materialized beside them and gestured toward a golden elevator that had not existed mere moments ago. The doors slid open with an ethereal chime, and the detective, realizing that resistance was probably futile, stepped inside. The elevator music was unsettlingly intense. It was, somehow, an orchestral arrangement of the sound of someone trying to remember why they walked into a room. The detective shuddered. The doors opened with a ding, revealing a grand chamber where 6 towering slices of toast sat on thrones made of meticulously stacked pancakes. They radiated authority, or at the very least, a strong scent of cinnamon and regret. "You stand before the Council of Toast," intoned the largest slice, which was particularly well buttered. "State your business." The detective crossed their arms. "I have no idea why I'm here." The toast slices whispered amongst themselves, their crusts crackling with tension. Finally, the most heavily jammed member of the council spoke. "Then you do not remember." "Remember what?" The detective sighed. "The prophecy." The detective groaned. "Oh no, not another prophecy." "Yes," said a slice covered in peanut butter. "Another prophecy." A dramatic silence fell over the room. The detective tapped their foot. "Well?" The buttered slice cleared its throat. "Long ago it was foretold that one would arrive from the land of soup, bearing the scars of the noodle incident, who would either save or doom the bread realm forever." The detective raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's me?" "You did fall from the sky," said the peanut butter toast. "And you do smell faintly of marinara," added the jam-covered slice. The detective sighed. "All right, what am I supposed to do?" The toast slices exchanged glances, then the buttered one spoke. "You must find the bagel of truth." The detective frowned. "That sounds made up." "All things are made up," said the jam toast, nodding solemnly. "Some are just more buttered than others." The peanut butter toast leaned forward. "The bagel of truth is the only thing that can confirm or deny the existence of the ultimate loaf." "The ultimate loaf?" The toast nodded in unison. "It is said to be the first bread, the perfect bread," whispered the buttered slice. "If it exists, all other bread is merely an echo of its doughy perfection." "And if it does not exist," added the jam slice, "then everything we know crumbles." The detective groaned. "Fine. Where do I find this bagel?" "In the Valley of Crumbs," said the peanut butter toast, voice heavy with reverence. "But beware. The Muffin Syndicate does not want it found." The detective rubbed their temples. "Of course there's a Muffin Syndicate." "Yes," said the buttered toast. "They have long opposed the Council of Toast, claiming that they too are a valid breakfast option." The detective narrowed their eyes. "And aren't they?" The room fell deathly silent. Somewhere a dramatic wind blew, carrying with it the scent of injustice and possibly cinnamon. The buttered toast seethed. "You tread dangerous ground, outsider." The detective put up their hands. All right. I'll find the bagel of truth." "Good," said the toast. "You will be escorted by our finest warrior." A door swung open, and a shadowy figure stepped into the chamber. The detective squinted, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It was a croissant, but not just any croissant. This one wore a bandolier filled with tiny butter packets and a pair of aviator sunglasses. It exuded the kind of energy that suggested it had seen things that could not be unseen. "My name is Flaky," said the croissant in a voice like a late-night jazz musician who had long since given up on happy endings. "Let's ride." The detective sighed and followed as Flaky led them toward a waiting carriage made entirely of waffles, pulled by a team of very determined breadsticks. As they climbed aboard, the detective looked up at the sky, which was now beginning to swirl ominously like a storm made of unresolved breakfast disputes. The Muffin Syndicate knew they were coming, and they were not going to make this easy. The waffle carriage jolted forward, its breadstick steeds galloping across the crusty expanse with an energy that could only be described as mildly inconvenienced. Flaky adjusted their aviator sunglasses and peered ahead, scanning the horizon as though expecting an ambush at any moment. "The Muffin Syndicate has eyes everywhere," Flaky muttered, "and sometimes ears, and once a nose, but we don't talk about that incident." The detective massaged their temples. "I don't understand how I ended up here. One minute I'm trying to make sense of the noodle incident, and the next I'm in the middle of a turf war between baked goods." Flaky let out a dry chuckle. "That's how they get you, kid. One minute you're just living your life, and the next, bam, you're deep in the pastry underworld, trying to figure out who needed who." The detective groaned. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do when we find this bagel of truth." Flaky adjusted their bandolier of butter packets. "That's the thing about truth, detective. You don't find it. It finds you. Usually when you least expect it. Usually when it's least convenient. Usually when—" A shadow passed over the carriage. Flaky's expression darkened. "Oh no, they sent the Blueberry Battalion." The detective looked up just in time to see a squadron of battle-hardened muffins descending from the sky, parachuting in using what appeared to be napkins folded into crude wings. They were armed, some with tiny forks, others with spoons sharpened into dangerous points, and one particularly menacing muffin wielded a French press, which hissed ominously. "Hold on," Flaky shouted, grabbing the reins and urging the breadsticks to move faster. "We're in for a crumby situation." The detective ducked as a muffin hurled a scalding hot espresso shot their way, narrowly missing their ear. "They have coffee artillery." "Of course they do." "They run the breakfast racket," Flaky snapped. "This was never just about bread. The Muffin Syndicate controls the entire morning meal economy. Coffee, danishes, even the black market for cold pizza." The detective was about to ask how cold pizza factored into any of this, but there was no time. The muffins landed on the waffle carriage, their eyes dark with the knowledge of forbidden recipes. "Surrender the bagel," growled the leader of the battalion, a burly, overbaked blueberry muffin with a scar running down his paper cup lining. "We don't have it yet," the detective protested. "Then surrender your dignity," the muffin barked. Flaky, still steering, reached into their bandolier and tossed a butter packet directly at the muffin's face. The packet exploded on impact, coating the muffin in a slick layer of golden dairy. "Ah, you monster!" the muffin howled. "You know we can't handle this much moisture." The detective seized the moment and grabbed a nearby rolling pin that had conveniently appeared in their hand. They swung it in a dramatic arc, sending one muffin flying off the carriage and into the depths of the bread realm below. It let out a final, despairing cry. "Tell my wife, she was always too crumbly." More muffins closed in. The detective and Flaky fought valiantly, wielding an arsenal of unexpected breakfast weaponry, a whisk, a pair of oversized tongs, and at one point an aggressively thrown bagel that had been hiding under the seat for an indeterminate amount of time. It was chaos, a blur of crumbs, steam, and the occasional splatter of jam. Just when it seemed like the battle was turning against them, a deafening horn blasted through the air. The muffins froze. Flaky paled. Oh no! A massive shadow loomed over them, its sheer presence sucking the warmth from the air. The detective turned to see the impossible. A colossal, terrifying scone, hovering just above them, its jagged edges radiating menace. Its surface was studded with raisins, each one glinting like the eyes of a vengeful god. Flaky whispered, "The scone, Father." The scone descended slowly, its immense weight pressing down on reality itself. The muffins immediately dropped to their knees, heads bowed in reverence. "You have disturbed the balance of breakfast," the scone father rumbled, its voice shaking the very foundations of the bread realm. "This war has gone on long enough." The detective gulped. "And what happens now?" The scone father loomed closer, its flaky layers crackling ominously. "Now, we negotiate." Silence fell. Even the wind dared not whisper. The detective sighed and adjusted their coat, which now smelled unmistakably of fresh-baked regret. "Great. I always wanted to be a diplomat in a pastry war." Flaky took off their sunglasses, rubbing their temple. "Yeah, well, hope you're good at politics, detective, because breakfast is never simple." The detective sat stiffly at a long banquet table carved from a single, ancient baguette. The scone father sat across from them, its layers stacked imperiously, its raisins glistening like tiny, judgmental sentinels. Flaky sat to the detective's right, gripping a teacup like it contained all the answers to the universe. The Muffin Syndicate's representatives, 3 slightly overcooked muffins and 1 jittery espresso shot in a tiny suit, sat to the left, watching the proceedings with narrowed eyes. In the middle of the table sat an ornate velvet-lined tray. On it rested the subject of all breakfast-based conflict, the bagel of truth. The bagel did not glow nor hum with arcane energy. It did not pulsate or whisper forbidden knowledge into the air. It was, at first glance, a completely normal bagel, except for the fact that everyone in the room was sweating bullets just looking at it. The scone father exhaled a deep, crumbly sigh. The time has come to settle this feud once and for all. Flaky leaned toward the detective and muttered, "I don't trust those muffins. They've got something up their wrappers." "I heard that," grumbled one of the muffins. The detective ignored them. "All right," they said, addressing the table. "What exactly does the bagel of truth do?" The room fell silent. The muffins shifted uncomfortably. The scone father coughed, sending a few crumbs onto the table. Finally, the espresso shot spoke, its voice a rapid-fire burst of syllables. "It reveals the deepest, undeniable truth of whoever takes a bite. No lies, no deception, just raw, brutal honesty, no exceptions, no loopholes, no second chances. Bam. Truth." The detective considered this. "So, why hasn't anyone eaten it yet?" Flaky tensed. The scone father rumbled. One of the muffins cleared its throat. "Well," said the most burnt-looking muffin, shifting uncomfortably, "it's, complicated." The scone father drummed its raisin-studded fingers against the table. "We have all built our empires on narratives. We tell our followers that breakfast is one thing or another thing, that toast reigns supreme, that muffins deserve equal standing, that scones are the rightful rulers of the morning table. But if someone takes a bite of that bagel, we'll know the truth," Flaky finished grimly. The detective narrowed their eyes. "And nobody wants to risk being wrong." The room collectively shuddered. The scone father's voice was grave. "If the bagel says toast is the superior breakfast, the Muffin Syndicate collapses overnight." If it declares muffins to be the one true breakfast food, growled a muffin, then toast loses its claim to the throne. And if it declares scones to be nothing more than dry biscuits, Flaky whispered, then the scone father's reign crumbles. The detective rubbed their temples. So you've been fighting over this bagel for centuries, but no one has been willing to take a bite because they're afraid of what it might say? The room nodded solemnly. The detective sighed. Well, I guess there's only one way to settle this. They reached for the bagel. Instantly, the entire room erupted into chaos. The Muffin Syndicate leaped to their feet, shouting, "Stop them!" Flaky yanked out a butter knife, which, given the circumstances, looked more menacing than it should have, while the Scone Father raised a flaky hand to command their forces. But the detective was faster. They grabbed the bagel of truth, lifted it to their mouth, and took a bite. The world stopped. A great and terrible silence fell over the bread realm. The air crackled. The walls of the chamber trembled. The detective's vision blurred, and suddenly everything around them melted away into a swirling void of pure, undistilled breakfast energy. And then they heard it. A voice, ancient and all-knowing, echoed through their very soul. It was the voice of every breakfast that had ever been eaten, of every brunch that had gone on for too long, of every midnight snack taken in secret shame. The truth, it boomed. The detective clutched their head as images flashed before their eyes. Eggs sizzling on a pan, coffee brewing in a distant land, a single perfect piece of toast being buttered in slow motion. And then, finally, the answer, the absolute, undeniable truth of breakfast. The detective gasped, eyes wide. The void vanished. They were back at the table. The Scone Father, Flaky, the Muffin Syndicate. Everyone was staring at them, breathless, waiting. The detective swallowed, and then they spoke. The true superior breakfast is... But before they could finish, reality itself panicked. The walls cracked. The sky above the bread realm tore open like an overstuffed pastry. A gust of wind howled through existence as the fabric of time and space recoiled from the sheer magnitude of the revelation. The bagel of truth, still clutched in the detective's hand, vibrated violently and then exploded. The force of the blast sent the detective flying backwards, knocking over chairs, toast thrones, and an entire plate of scones. The Scone Father let out a mighty roar as the entire chamber shook, and for a brief, horrifying moment, it seemed as though the bread realm itself would collapse into nothingness. And then everything went quiet. The detective coughed, waving away a cloud of bagel dust. They sat up, blinking, trying to regain focus. The table was in ruins. The Muffin Syndicate was scattered, their wrappers torn, their expressions dazed. Flaky was sprawled out next to them, still gripping their butter knife. And the Scone Father was gone. In its place was a single, perfectly round scone, sitting motionless on the floor. It did not move. It did not speak. It was, as far as anyone could tell, just a scone. The detective slowly stood. What just happened? Flaky groaned, sitting up and shaking crumbs from their layers. The bagel of truth couldn't handle the pressure. It self-destructed. One of the muffins whimpered. So, we'll never know? A heavy silence filled the room. The detective took a deep breath. They could say it. They had seen the truth. The knowledge still burned within them. But something inside them hesitated. Some truths, they realized, were too powerful to be spoken aloud. Instead, they dusted themselves off and adjusted their coat. Well, that was dramatic. The muffins, the croissant, and the various breakfast representatives simply stared at the ruins of their centuries-old conflict. Then, finally, Flaky sighed and stood up. Come on, detective. Let's get out of here before someone starts another war over flapjacks. The detective nodded, stepping over the inert scone and heading for the exit. As they walked away, they couldn't help but glance back one last time, wondering what might have been different if only the bagel had held together for one more second. But some questions, they decided, were better left unanswered. The detective and Flaky trudged through the remnants of the bread realm, their footsteps muffled by the endless landscape of crumbs. The air smelled of warm toast and the lingering scent of regret. In the distance, the ruined council chamber smoldered, as if mourning the war that had never quite been won or lost. "So," Flaky said, adjusting their aviator sunglasses, "what now?" The detectives sighed, hands in their pockets. "I don't know. I was sort of hoping for a neat resolution." Flaky scoffed. "Ain't no such thing. You should know that by now." They passed a group of dazed muffins sitting in a circle, holding a quiet support meeting about existential crises. One was softly sobbing into a cup of cold coffee. Another was staring into the distance, whispering, "What if I was always just a cupcake in disguise?" The detective chose not to get involved. A sudden rustling caught their attention. Something was moving beneath the crumbs. Flaky tensed, reaching for a butter packet. The detective instinctively took a step back. Then, with an unceremonious pop, a single donut emerged from the ground. It was small, innocuous, perfectly round with a suspiciously well-defined glaze that glistened under the existential weight of the moment. It spoke in a voice both sugary and ancient. "The whole remains." The detective blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "The whole remains," the donut repeated solemnly. "You destroyed the bagel of truth, but the whole persists." Flaky took off their sunglasses. "Detective, I don't like where this is going." The detective crouched down, inspecting the donut. "What whole?" The donut shuddered. "The whole that binds all things, the absence that defines presence, the void within the dough." The detective rubbed their temples. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," the donut interrupted, "that the bagel of truth was never about the bagel. It was about the hole inside it. And that hole still exists." A chill ran down the detective's spine. They looked down at the ground. The crumbs trembled. A low hum filled the air, like the sound of 1,000 forgotten breakfasts murmuring in unison. Flaky inhaled sharply. "We got to go. Now." The ground beneath them ripped open. Not like an earthquake, not like a sinkhole. This was something else entirely. A perfect, swirling vortex of nothingness yawned before them, stretching infinitely in all directions. It was hungry. The donut tumbled toward the void. "The whole remains," it cried one last time before vanishing into the abyss. The detective grabbed Flaky by the arm and ran. The world was collapsing around them. Muffins, toast, even the remnants of the great Scone Father's empire, all of it was being pulled into the ever-growing hole, disappearing without so much as a goodbye. "Where are we running to?" the detective shouted over the deafening roar of unraveling reality. "Anywhere but here," Flaky yelled back. "Do you still have that emergency escape hatch?" The detective frantically checked their pockets. Pens, loose change, a half-eaten fortune cookie from a case they couldn't quite remember, and then a single tattered door handle. "Found it." "Then use it." The detective didn't think. They grabbed the handle, held it out in front of them, and twisted. Reality complied. A door materialized in midair, old, wooden, creaking under the pressure of being an impossible exit. The detective didn't wait. They shoved it open and dove through, dragging Flaky with them. The last thing they saw before the bread realm was consumed entirely was the ever-expanding hole in the universe. And then they landed, hard, on carpet. The detective groaned, rolling onto their back. The ceiling above them was made of cheap office tiles. A fluorescent light flickered ominously. They sat up. They were in a cubicle. Flaky groaned beside them. "Okay, this is new." A phone rang. Not in front of them, no. This was somewhere beyond. An echo through an office space that felt just a little too quiet. The detective pulled themselves to their feet. The walls of the cubicle were beige. The computer on the desk was an ancient relic of early desktop technology. A nameplate sat beside it, but the text had been scratched out. Flaky adjusted their butter-stained coat. "Where the hell are we?" The detective opened a drawer. Inside was a single, neatly printed piece of paper. It read, "Welcome to the Department of Unfinished Business." The phone kept ringing. Flaky took a deep breath. "I really don't want to answer that." The detective stared at the phone. The ringing grew louder. Reality buzzed around it, vibrating with something that felt like anticipation. They reached out, picked up the receiver, and a familiar voice, heavy with the weight of 1,000 untold mysteries, whispered, "Detective, you dropped something." The detective gripped the phone tightly. "What did I drop?" The voice on the other end chuckled, low and knowing. "Something important, something irreplaceable, and now it's here, waiting." Flaky leaned in, whispering, "If that's the walrus again, tell him I'm still not paying for that noodle." The detective ignored them. "Where am I?" "You already know," the voice murmured. The detective turned, taking in the cubicle once more. The air smelled of stale coffee and unsaid goodbyes. The fluorescent lights flickered with the same uncertainty they had always carried, as though they, too, were trapped in a cycle of endless work, with no resolution. Beyond the cubicle walls, rows upon rows of identical workstations stretched into infinity. The hum of computers, the scratch of pens, the occasional sigh of someone who had long given up on understanding anything, all of it filled the space with an eerie, mechanical rhythm. Flaky reached out and poked a nearby desk. It wobbled slightly, as though unsure whether it wanted to exist. "This place feels wrong." The detective put the receiver back to their ear. "What is this place?" A long pause. Then, "The Department of Unfinished Business." Something cold curled around the detective's spine. "And what do you do here?" "We file," the voice said simply. "We sort. We archive. All things left unresolved find their way to us eventually. Lost thoughts, abandoned stories, forgotten questions. Even detectives who leave too many loose ends." The detective's grip on the phone tightened. "And the whole? The one that swallowed the bread realm. What happens to it?" The voice hummed thoughtfully. "That depends. Do you want to finish this? Or leave it undone?" The detective hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? For as long as they could remember, they had been chasing something. The noodle incident, the muffin syndicate, the bagel of truth. But none of it had ever truly ended. It had only unraveled into something stranger, something deeper. What if there was no real resolution? What if the only thing they had ever been chasing was the next step forward? Flaky tapped their shoulder. "Hey, look at this." The detective turned. Flaky had pulled open a filing cabinet, revealing an impossibly long drawer stuffed with case files. Each folder was labeled in neat, bureaucratic handwriting. The case of the missing, meaning the investigation of the vanishing endings, the search for the last answer, and finally, the final case. The detective's fingers hovered over the last file. The paper was warm to the touch, as though it had been waiting for them. They pulled it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for a single line of text. "You're almost there." The phone crackled in their hand. The voice on the other end let out a soft, almost amused sigh. "Well, detective, do you want to know how this ends?" The detective looked around at the endless office, the infinite cubicles, the papers that had nowhere to go but here. Flaky watched them carefully, their expression unreadable behind their sunglasses. A choice. A real one. Maybe the only one that had ever mattered. "No," the detective said, and let the file slip from their hands. The paper scattered, twisting into nothing before it ever hit the floor. The lights overhead flickered once, twice. And then, darkness. A ringing phone. a desk, a case waiting to be solved. The detective exhaled and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" The voice on the other end smiled. "You dropped something."